Hello, Brobs. We're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me by Dorothy Bloch. Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide. Miss Bloch has not convinced me that most of these parents wanted to kill their children. She has hinted that the children thought they may be killed by the parents, but nowhere did I think that there was an impulse by the parents to kill the children. Back to page 82. I didn't come out of my mother's stomach. Now, following his game with the cars, he returned to making more complicated models, this time directing his choice at the first to any fighter plane, and then only to those of World War II. He also restricted himself to tanks and battleships of the same era. This occupation afforded me an opportunity to become his indispensable assistant. At first, with an air of indulging me, he permitted me to read the directions step by step as he put the parts together. Sensing that he experienced help as an attempt to wipe him out, I was careful never to exceed the limits he assigned me and waited patiently for him to request aid when the tank task became too difficult. Gradually, he experienced our cooperative effort as fun and delighted in asking me when he arrived, "Do you have your reading glasses on?" Model making continued for several months to the exclusion of all other activity and showed no signs of diminishing when I began to feel that as much had been derived from it as could be expected in terms of the growth of our relationship, and when it seemed as though Jose was beginning to use it as a resistance to further development, I proposed that we limit it to once a month and find other things to do. He accepted this arrangement, but was left once more with the problem of an unstructured session. After a few sessions of board games, during which time I soon learned Jose had been giving some thought to his next activity, he introduced a game with soldiers, retaining the basic structure of our previous game with cars. Very gradually, it had become apparent that he had one major preoccupation, war and destruction, to which at first gave very quiet expression. His concentration on fighter plane models had already indicated this direction. Now, the tabletop became a battlefield, and once more the paint jars, the box of chalk, and the crayons were the props. This time, fortifications. He divided the soldiers between us, each of us having a doctor in a plane and a soldier in whom our identities were vested. The importance he gave the doctor indicated Jose's profound fear of war, as did his selection for his identifying soldier, the only one who carried not a gun but a coffee mug, just as in the traffic game. He encouraged me to talk to my men and relished my manner of speaking, moved to laughter by such terms as bombardment. He himself spoke very softly, almost inaudibly, and once more gave me the impression that most of the game was occurring inside his head. He was also very surreptitious in the movement of his men, frequently using the word sneak to describe it. The next session he came without his cars, announcing that we would each have a plane and instructing me to divide the soldiers so that he would have just a few men, leaving the bulk of them to me, and also giving me the jeep. "And talk the way you did the last time," he directed. After we had each selected the soldier who represented us, he asserted, "I'm putting mine in a safe place." He removed the cover of a container of wooden beads and buried his soldier, leaving only the tip of the face showing. He then replaced the cover so the soldier was completely invisible. "It's an invincible tank," he commented. "But how are you going to talk to your men?" I asked. "By radio," was the immediate reply, and a more accurate symbol of Jose's way of relating to the world at that point would have been hard to find. Oh, it's genius, actually. You're protected inside the tank and you use a radio to communicate. What are you going to fucking yell to them while you're in a battle? "Hey, buddy!" That was the beginning of a kind of play that eventually led Jose out of his hiding place to confront and conquer his enemies, freeing him finally to establish his identity in a more friendly world as an American. Another point here is that Not everything a child does is some kind of dysfunction when they're playing. Sometimes they're just playing. And this lady takes everything as she's discovered the problem, which, I mean, seems kind of narcissistic. He soon became more active in this war, constantly attacking my men, bombing them, and wounding me seriously. He interspersed the war sessions with board games, which also became an instrument for the release of his aggression. He is a boy. He played with increasing spontaneity and real fun, pretending repeatedly to kill my token, at which time I exclaimed to his delight that I was being murdered, shot, stabbed, and slaughtered. Yeah, that just means vanquished in kid language, lady. It doesn't always mean to kill him. When we returned to the war game after a brief interval, it progressed on a new and expanded level. I had bought some new airplanes and thereby revolutionized our activity. Not only were we now impressively airborne, but we were involved in a new industry, the construction of hangars with building blocks. Our planes now took off on the tabletop and landed on the desk. More significantly, however, we were no longer enemies but allies. Our common foe, the Germans, were at first located on the desk. One day, Jose related to me his new television experience, a war program that he recommended I watch. Later, he added still another. Both of these became the models of our activity. Who do you want to be? Jose inquired after the soldiers had been divided and the armies deployed. I haven't quite decided, I replied. Who do you think I should be? You can be anyone you want, he asserted with some impatience. You be the leader. Well, I said, somewhat dismayed by this threat to the liberation of his fantasy. I could be the leader, but why don't you be the leader? No, I'm the lieutenant. There was no room for argument. This is me, he informed me, selecting the soldier with the coffee mug. Which is you? This is me. I selected one at random. Then, each of us grasping our identifying soldier, we set forth for battle. You're supposed to give the orders, Jose reminded me. Oh, I responded as though it had slipped my mind. What orders do you think I should give? Jose snorted. Did you ever hear a leader ask the lieutenant what orders he should give? Well, maybe you should be the leader. No, I'm the lieutenant. Give the order to go forward. Go forward, men, I complied weakly. That's not the way to do it, said Jose in disgust. Here, you be the lieutenant. And he stepped in front of me in the position of leader. Forward, men, he commanded, and from then on, Jose directed our activity. Thus began the new stage of our battle. Our field was now the entire room. One day, I was momentarily surprised to see Jose toss his coat in the middle of the floor on arriving. This is the mountains where the Americans are hiding, he announced. The next 10 minutes were spent in deploying the soldiers in the gullies and caves and hilltops created by the folds of his jacket. From the American encampment, we moved to the far reaches of the room, where among the cushions on the couch we effectively laid out the German fortifications, always carrying our identifying soldier, usually isolated from the main force and outnumbered. We frequently engaged in stealthy reconnoitering missions, sneaking up on the German camp. Sometimes traveling on foot, sometimes in our single fighter planes, we made forays into enemy territory. Occasionally, one of us was captured, only to be rescued miraculously by the other, who brought up reinforcements. There were some moments of comic relief. I had already noted Jose's usually concealed but lively sense of humor. And now I always insisted on a literal interpretation of army life. As soon as we had settled into an area, I drew forth our imaginary rations and ate with relish, identifying our victuals. That's a delicious egg sandwich, I commented very soberly, and Jose went off into gales of laughter at what apparently struck him as an incongruity. Another detail that never failed to draw a comment from me was Jose's inevitable choice of his favorite soldier. Always taking a coffee break, I chided, with predictably hilarious results. And this play went on, stretching from weeks into months, at a point where progress seemed to be at a standstill. I added some new equipment to the playroom, a puppet stage, and some new hand puppets, mainly an alligator with huge sharp-toothed jaws and a crow with an enormous beak. I had always had an assortment of puppets around, a family and odd characters ranging from a witch to a clown, but Jose had never evinced any interest in them. The alligator, however, immediately intrigued him. He picked it up, studied its jaws, and completely lost himself in staging a scene without words in which the alligator avidly devoured every other character, one by one. When the last had been consumed and thrown to the floor, Jose suddenly looked up at me a little sheepishly, as though aware of, on some level, of the significance of his play, and proceeded to pummel the alligator. During the next few sessions, he ignored the puppets. When he returned to them, however, it was evident that he had spent the interim creating a structure for a new activity. He discarded the stage and concentrated on an open roof dollhouse, to which he had heretofore paid only glancing attention, usually at the end of the session. Grinning broadly, he would announce that he wanted to fix it up, a process that involved dumping the furniture topsy-turvy into the center of each of the 5 rooms. Now he selected for his purpose only 2 characters, the alligator, which he manipulated, and the crow, which he assigned to me. Well, he announced through the jaws of the alligator, I guess I gotta fix up this room. I like it comfortable. The alligator then proceeded to knock everything over in the largest room, permitting only one tiny oasis for the bed, which was then extravagantly fitted with most of the little pillows and blankets of the entire household and equipped with a night table and an assortment of miniature books. The alligator lolled in this splendor with an indescribable joie de vivre. Aren't you fixing up your room? The alligator then inquired of the crow. Why, of course, said the crow. I was just wondering which room I should take. Well, how about the room right next to mine? Suggested the alligator. That looks like a mighty fine one, responded the crow, but I guess it needs some fixing up. The crow then proceeded to duplicate the alligator's actions, chaotically toppling chairs, tables, and cabinets, but again leaving a little clearing for the bed with the further comment in imitation of Jose, which set him roaring with laughter. There's nothing like a nice, neat room. The alligator and the crow thus lived together in what approximated connubial bliss, with the alligator assuming the responsibility for maintaining the household, and the crow performing the domestic chores. I think I'm getting hungry, announced the alligator. It's time to eat. Guess I'll go out and kill a couple of people. Come back soon, chimed the crow. And out he went, returning soon with 2 corpses. I'm pretty thirsty, he stated. Gotta drain their blood for cocktails. Here, put the rest in the refrigerator, he directed, handing me an imaginary pitcher. He then served himself and the crow. Here's blood on the rocks, he offered. Life for the alligator and the crow constantly bubbled with gore and mirth. Well, I mean, he's not wrong, although they don't really eat humans. By this time, Jose's personality had undergone radical change. Compulsions were a thing of the past, as his puppet plays indicated. His inhibitions had decreased, and his behavior had become more spontaneous. He had also found his sense of humor, which was highly developed. His fears of his father had diminished to a point where he dared take him on in argument. At first, his father attempted to meet this new assertiveness with stormy repression, but under my direction, he finally acceded to the new order and allowed Jose to express himself. In her monthly sessions with me, his mother had struggled for some understanding of her role in Jose's problems. Once I had grasped the underlying structure of his opposition, I was able to help her reduce the areas of friction between them by assisting her with such practical details as Jose dressing and undressing. Since Jose loved school and would have hated to miss any of it, it was a simple enough matter to make him completely responsible for getting himself ready. The evening routine was somewhat more complicated, but also eventually yielded. Initially, she was somewhat taken aback by my description of Jose as an extraordinarily obedient child who never misbehaved. Although she had referred to her greater strictness with him, which she began to understand in terms of her relaxation with Mary, she had little awareness of the degree of repression that prevailed in her household and was reflected in Jose. Even though she could acknowledge the severity of the home in which she herself was brought up, as Jose emerged from his withdrawal, he became a more enjoyable companion and now delighted both his parents. His silent subversion disappeared. He had not yet become an American, however, although it was not until the resolution of his fantasy that I finally understood its direction. In retrospect, it is now clear that he had already been leading up to it in his model making and in his drawings, which had remained a continuing focus of his interest. Dude, I got 4 more pages. Interest throughout his treatment, concentrating exclusively on soldiers and war scenes. The first sign that he was preparing for the denouement came with his selection of German planes and German submarines for his models. His drawings had also begun to concern themselves with German subjects, German guns and helmets, and finally German soldiers. His drawings of battle scenes assumed a new character. Although he still concentrated on Americans in combat, they were invariably being bombarded or wiped out by the Germans, who at first remained outside the picture, only their bombs and missiles being represented. I had been struck from the very beginning by Jose's use of the term German rather than Nazi. Each time I heard it, I had reacted with a question that only now began to define itself. When he returned to the war game after the weeks of domesticity enjoyed by the alligator and the crow, he introduced a significant and final change in that activity. At first covertly, but then with increasing assertiveness, he began to reveal his conviction of German superiority and his unbounded admiration for their military know-how. There was no piece of equipment that did not establish it. Look at this powerful rifle, he said, admiring the imaginary weapon. It's much better than the Americans. And do you know what kind of pistol this is? It's a Luger. It's the best. After the opposing armies had been deployed, Jose would also scrutinize the American forces and state disparagingly, their material is not too good. Clay now became a necessary feature of our activity. Using a liberal admixture of water in a truly abandoned mood, Jose frequently turned the tabletop into the muddiest terrain imaginable. And he exultantly maneuvered the armies, flooding them and half burying them in ditches, the Germans always seeming to get the better of it. When the conflict was restored to the larger battleground represented by the desk, the couch, and the floor, I began to notice a curious phenomenon. Just as the armies were getting ready for the assault, Jose would dart away from the Americans, whom we were both manipulating on the desk or the floor, and join the Germans on the couch. After momentarily directing their side, imitating the sound of the machine guns that were trained on the Americans, he then slipped back to rejoin me as though nothing had happened. I see you're helping the Germans, I commented, deadpan, as he avoided my glance. Just for a minute, Jose stated casually. It was only a matter of time, however, before the mounting scale of Jose's help resulted in an unabashed surrender of his role as an American in favor of the German side. At the end of one session, he finally bombarded the American camp and triumphantly announced, "They're slaughtered." 3 years had passed since Jose had entered treatment. In all that time, he had referred to his father only once, and then very reluctantly in connection with putting decals on the models. It's very difficult to put the tiny pieces on, I had observed. After watching him struggle with them, I heard a mumble that sounded just like my father, which was followed after some urging with, "My father yells at me sometimes when I lose the pieces." Now, soon after having vanquished the Americans in battle, he arrived at his session one day, proudly bearing American military insignia. My father gave them to me, he disclosed. "What? What are they?" "Why, what are they?" I asked. "My father's army insignia," he replied. "That's what he wore when he was a soldier in the U.S. Army." "He was a lieutenant. When did he give them to you?" I pursued, quite stunned by a development that had followed so quickly the resolution of his fantasy. "Oh," said Jose, "I asked him about his experiences in the war, and he put his uniform on for me. He was in some pretty big battles." "You're very proud of him," I commented. "You ought to see his souvenirs. He keeps them in a chest. And he said I could have these. My mother's going to sew them on my jacket." Jose never returned to the war games after this, having proven that he could vanquish the real enemy, the Americans. He appeared ready to abandon the role of German. His father's insignia from now on established his true identity. His fantasy and its resolution represented the first stage of his struggle back to health. My major concentration during this period was the creation of an environment that would enable him to liberate his aggressive feelings via his fantasies. So severe were the repressions that almost a year went by before he dared expose them even more, even once. The compulsions that had kept them in check were possibly a response to the repressive force exerted by both parents, so that Jose had to control not only forbidden feelings, but also forbidden impulses. The fantasy of the flood and that drowned his parents almost took him by surprise, as did his initial play with the voracious, man-eating alligator. Because of his extreme passivity, he had to be encouraged, first of all, to adopt an active role. To that end, I tried never to intrude by assuming a dominating position, but always managed to leave the choices to him so that his fantasy could develop unimpeded. Until he advanced to an aggressive role by declaring that his was a police car, for instance, I maintained an equally passive position. Once he announced himself, however, I took his cue and proceeded to engage in behavior designed to encourage his aggression. And I lost my spot. Within the framework of the fantasy. Similarly, I refused the role of leader, which would have placed me in the position of determining the direction of his fantasy, just as I waited for him to indicate my role as the crow. Because his sense of humor was so available to him, I stimulated it as a means of relaxing his repressions. Since he had withdrawn to a point where he did not even allow me to enter his line of vision, in order to help him release his murderous fantasies, my final task was to establish myself as a helpful and trustworthy ally. You are an ally, but an ally. Starting with very cautiously with the silent procession of the two cars, he at first assigned me the role of enemy. Only by dint of becoming his indispensable assistant, and by gradually letting it be known that I accepted and even enjoyed aggressive feelings, did I make it possible for him to transform both his fantasy and my role in it. I then became an ally, and we were Americans at war with a common enemy. Enemy, the Germans. When the war fantasy was resumed after the interlude of the alligator and the crow, it was clear that my complete acceptance of his role as a martial killer companion and my readiness to share the bloody spoils permitted him to take the next step and to expose his secret that he was a German and the Americans were the enemy. He was then able to triumph over them, and by overturning his terror, to establish his mastery and to claim his true status. That his first act after his triumph over the Americans in fantasy was to invite his father to discuss his experiences in the war, and then for him proudly to claim the insignia of an American soldier, dramatically established the unconscious direction of his drive toward health from the very first session, when he revealed his central preoccupation with the disclosure, "I'm not an American." His fantasied adoption of the identity of an enemy alien had defended him against his fears of infanticide by explaining and justifying his father's murderous feelings towards him. His father didn't have murderous feelings. Only when he had developed enough ego strength to establish his superiority and to defeat his enemy, the Americans, did his terror diminish sufficiently for him to resolve his fantasy and establish his true identity. He was then ready to verbalize directly the murderous and libidinal feelings that he had thus far expressed only in fantasy. How far are we in this book? Roughly halfway through. About ready to throw it into the fireplace. But we will continue. That's all for now. Goodbye, bruv. Good boy.